How would you recognize a witch? Would she have a long, crooked nose? Would she have a wart on her chin? Would she wear black and have an evil laugh? Would she live in a scary house? My family moved across the street from just such a person when I was 6 years old. When I was 6 years old, my family moved across the street from Mrs. Weinstein, who was probably just a nice old lady. She spent her days working in her garden, and she spent her evenings reading. As I say, she was probably just a nice old lady. But Mrs. Weinstein had a black cat, which had the annoying habit of crying in the early morning hours. These cries sounded just like a baby crying. So you can just imagine what the neighbors thought. Now, in fairness, no children ever showed up missing. But when have facts ever got in the way of a good story? All right, so let's review the facts. Mrs. Weinstein was an ancient woman whose skin was severely wrinkled by years of exposure to the sun. She had a long, crooked nose. She had a wart on her chin with long hair growing out of it. Ew. And she always wore black. If Mrs. Weinstein wasn't a witch, she was certainly in dire need of a makeover. Mrs. Weinstein lived in a small, white, two-story house surrounded by weeping willows and a wrought iron fence. By day, her house didn't look that scary. Certainly, her house was in need of repair, and her paint was cracking. But it wasn't that scary, at least by day. However, at night, her house was quite haunting. I can't really tell you why her house was so unnerving. I suspect that we see what we want to see. And sometimes we want to be scared. I can tell you that when the strong Gulf wind blew, it howled through the rafters of that house and summoned, as if to summon the demons of hell. With a strong wind, those trees swayed and looked like hands grasping for prey. Well, needless to say, we all wanted to know the truth about Mrs. Weinstein. And I admit, I tried to get my sister to do the job. But she said, "Oh, I'm not permitted to cross the street by myself." Why is it that sisters always have a good excuse when they don't want to do something? So somehow the job fell on my shoulders. So now follow me now as I run across the street and I crawl on my elbows, army style, along the black wrought iron fence. Hidden from the road, beneath that thick hedge, was a large black cast iron kettle filled with flowers. Now, maybe it's innocent, but maybe it isn't. But what's that? Beside that kettle is that darn black cat. And she's glaring at me as if you don't belong here. You can stay, but I'm running home as fast as I can. My loving sister laughs and laughs and laughs and suggests that I might be a bit of a coward. I suspect my sister has a plan for becoming an only child. But even at 6 years old, I realize that if I'm ever going to have a sense of dignity and self-respect, I know I'm going to have to go back. But I'm not going to go back unarmed. I filled my pockets with rocks. I filled my front pockets, my back pockets completely with rocks. I figure if Mrs. Weinstein tries something, I can throw rocks at her and get away. I then pull out my shirt tail and cover up my ammunition. And once prepared, I go to pay my respects to Mrs. Weinstein as she's working in her garden. "How are you doing today, Mrs. Weinstein?" Mrs. Weinstein replies, "I don't particularly like children." Now, ladies and gentlemen, you can take that one of two ways. You could take it that she finds children to be annoying. I have a younger sister, I tend to agree. But you could take it that Mrs. Weinstein's dislike of children meant that she prefers the nice, tender taste of babies. I changed the subject. Where's your husband, Mrs. Weinstein? Mr. Weinstein died 5 years ago. What kind of work did you do, Mrs. Weinstein? Mr. Weinstein was a mortician for 50 years. A mortician. Isn't that a person who buries people? When I look up, Mrs. Weinstein is within arm's reach of me. I put my hand in my back pocket and grab a handful of rocks. Mrs. Weinstein reaches into her apron and pulls out a handful of candy. Would you like some candy, little boy? I shake no with every ounce of my being. Then Mrs. Weinstein leans in and says, "What's wrong, little boy? Did you think I was going to eat you up?" Ladies and gentlemen, dignity and self-respect are no longer my highest priorities. I try to run home as fast as I can. I take a step and I fall down. I get up and I take another step and I fall down again. My pockets are so full of rocks. I can't run. And all the while I could hear Mrs. Weinstein cackling. What would you do? I took off my pants and I ran home in my underwear. No, Mrs. Weinstein and I never became friends. But now you know why. I really believe that Wicked Widow Weinstein really was a witch.